Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling back about 2,000 years to ancient Rome. But we're not heading to the Colosseum or the Senate, or any of those grand marble buildings you've seen in movies. No, we're going somewhere much more essential to daily Roman life. We're heading to a bakery, a pistrina, as the Romans called it. And we're going to spend a day in the life of someone who made the one thing every Roman citizen needed every single day: bread. Before we start, if you enjoy this kind of content, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more. But only if you genuinely want to. No pressure at all. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see the global audience for these videos. People settling in for sleep in one time zone, starting their day in another, all connected by a shared interest in history. Now, get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, maybe turn on a fan for that background white noise if that's your thing. Dim the lights, and let's ease into this journey together. We're going back to ancient Rome, to a time when your entire day might revolve around fire, flour, and the endless rhythm of making bread. Let's set the scene. You're in Pompeii, or Rome, or any reasonably sized Roman city in the 1st century CE. It's early, very early, maybe 3 or 4 a.m., and you're making your way through dark, narrow streets toward your workplace, the bakery. Roman bakeries weren't like modern bakeries. They weren't cheerful shops with glass cases displaying pastries and someone behind a counter taking orders. A Roman pistrina was part industrial mill, part oven facility, part shop, and depending on the bakery, part stable for the donkeys or mules that powered the grain mills. The whole operation was contained in a single building or a connected series of rooms, and the operation ran from the early hours of the morning until the bread was sold, usually by mid-afternoon. The building itself was typically made of stone, brick, or concrete. Roman concrete, by the way, was remarkably durable. Some of those bakery ovens in Pompeii survived being buried under volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years and are still standing. The walls were thick, which they needed to be, both for structural support and because bakeries were fire hazards. When you're maintaining an oven hot enough to bake dozens of loaves at a time, every day, for years, you want substantial walls between that heat and the neighboring buildings. The floor was usually stone or concrete as well, often with a slight slope or drainage channels because bakeries got wet. Washing grain, cleaning equipment, and managing the general mess of flour, dust, and dough required water. Lots of it. And that water needed somewhere to go. The space was divided into distinct areas, each with its specific function. There was the milling room, where grain was ground into flour, the kneading room, where flour became dough, the baking room with the massive oven, and the shop area, where finished bread was sold to customers. If you worked in a bakery, you'd become intimately familiar with all these spaces, because Roman bakeries operated as integrated businesses, and workers often rotated through different tasks. Let's start with the milling room. This is where raw grain transformed into flour, and this was, without exaggeration, one of the most physically demanding jobs in the entire bakery operation. The Romans used large millstones, often made of volcanic rock, because volcanic stone was hard, rough, and didn't wear down easily. These mills came in different designs, but the most common type consisted of 2 parts: a fixed lower stone shaped like a cone, and an upper stone shaped like an hourglass that fit over the cone and rotated around it. The upper stone could weigh several hundred pounds. To turn it, you needed power. Sometimes this power came from slaves or workers, pushing wooden poles attached to the stone, walking in endless circles like a human-powered merry-go-round. But more commonly, especially in larger bakeries, the power came from donkeys or mules. These animals would be harnessed to poles extending from the millstone, and they'd walk in circles for hours, turning the stone, grinding grain into flour. The sound of a working bakery started with this milling. The grinding of stone on stone created a constant, low rumbling sound, sometimes punctuated by the crunch of grain being crushed. Add to that the sound of donkeys or mules, their hooves on the stone floor, their occasional braying, the creaking of wooden harnesses, and you had a working environment that was never quiet. The smell was distinctive too. Grain has its own scent, earthy and slightly sweet. When it's being ground, that smell intensifies. Mix in the smell of working animals, the dust of flour in the air, and later, as the day progressed, the overwhelming smell of baking bread, and you had an olfactory experience that was uniquely a bakery. Then there was the kneading room. After grain became flour, that flour needed to become dough, and this required both water and an enormous amount of physical labor. Romans didn't have electric mixers. They had hands, arms, and sheer muscle power. Large stone or wooden troughs held the dough, and workers would knead it by hand, or sometimes by foot, pressing and folding and working the dough until it achieved the right consistency. Kneading dough for one loaf is a decent arm workout. Kneading dough for 50 or 100 or 200 loaves. That's a full-body ordeal that you do every single day. Your arms would burn, your back would ache from bending over the trough. Your hands would become so familiar with the texture of dough that you could judge its readiness by feel alone. And then there was the oven, the centerpiece of any bakery, the element that transformed flour and water and labor into food. Roman bread ovens were substantial structures, often built directly into the wall or as freestanding dome-shaped constructions made of brick and concrete. They were heated by wood fires, and getting an oven to the right temperature and maintaining that temperature throughout a baking session required skill, experience, and constant attention. These weren't small ovens. A commercial bakery oven might be 6 or 8 feet across, tall enough that you could almost stand up inside if it weren't, hot enough to bake bread. The oven opening was usually at floor level or slightly elevated, and bakers used long wooden peels, basically large flat paddles on long handles, to slide loaves in and pull them out. The heat from these ovens was intense. Not just warm, not just hot, but face-meltingly, eyebrow-singeing, step back or your tunic will catch fire hot. And you worked near this heat for hours, during the hottest part of the operation, loading loaves, monitoring the baking, removing finished bread. In summer, in a Roman summer, where temperatures could easily hit 90 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, working near a bread oven was its own special form of endurance test. The shop area was the final station, the place where all that labor transformed into commerce. This was usually a counter open to the street, where finished loaves were displayed and sold. Romans bought their bread fresh daily. There was no refrigeration, no preservatives, and bread would go stale quickly. So every day, the bakery would produce its bread, sell it, and start the process over again. If you worked in a Roman bakery, this was your world. Stone, flour, fire, heat, sweat, and the endless cycle of production, day after day, week after week, year after year. Welcome to work. So who were you exactly, if you worked in a Roman bakery? The answer is more complicated than you might think, because Roman society had layers of status and freedom that don't map neatly onto modern categories. You might be a slave. Slavery was fundamental to the Roman economy, and bakeries, like most Roman businesses, relied heavily on enslaved labor. If you were a slave working in a bakery, you had no choice in the matter. You were property, owned by the bakery owner, and you worked because that's what you were forced to do. Your day started when you were told to start, ended when you were told to stop, and the work you did benefited someone else entirely. But here's something that might surprise you. Not all slaves lived identical lives, and some slaves in specialized trades like baking actually had relatively better conditions than slaves in other occupations. This isn't to romanticize slavery, which was always a brutal institution, but a slave who was trained in baking, who had valuable skills, might be treated somewhat better simply because they represented an investment. A dead or incapacitated slave was a loss to the owner, so there was at least some incentive to keep skilled slaves healthy enough to work. Some slaves even received a small allowance, a peculium, which they could save. If they saved enough, they might eventually buy their freedom, becoming liberti, freedmen. Which brings us to the second category of bakery workers, the freed slaves. Freedmen were former slaves who had gained their freedom, either by purchase, as a gift from their owner, or through manumission specified in an owner's will. Once freed, they were technically free Roman citizens, though they occupied a somewhat complicated social position. They had more rights than slaves, but fewer than free-born citizens. They couldn't hold certain political offices, and they often maintained social and economic ties to their former owners. Many freedmen continued working in the same trade they'd learned as slaves. If you'd spent 20 years learning the baking trade as a slave, it made sense to continue as a freedman, and many former slaves eventually opened their own small bakeries or worked as paid employees in larger operations. Some became quite successful. We have inscriptions and tombstones from Pompeii and Rome mentioning freedmen who became prosperous bakery owners. Then there were free citizens, people who had never been enslaved and who chose to work in bakeries. This might seem like an odd choice given the hard labor involved, but baking was an essential trade, and a successful baker could make a decent living. Free citizens might work as hired laborers, paid by the day, or they might be apprentices learning the trade, or they might be family members of the bakery owner, helping with the family business. And finally, there were the bakery owners themselves, the pistrins. Some were freedmen who'd worked their way up. Some were born into baking families. Some were small-time operators running one modest bakery. Others owned multiple bakeries and were quite wealthy by Roman standards. Bakery owners could be influential in their local communities. Bread was essential to Roman life, and the person who controlled the bread supply had a certain amount of power and respect. So your status in a bakery depended on where you fell in this hierarchy. If you were a slave, you had no freedom and no hope of advancement except possibly saving for manumission. If you were a freedman, you had freedom but limited social mobility, and often still owed obligations to your former owner. If you were a free citizen, you had full rights, but might still be doing back-breaking labor for modest wages. And if you were a bakery owner, you had the challenges of running a business in a competitive market while managing workers who might be unwilling slaves, moderately content freedmen, or hired free labor. The work was the same regardless. Grain needed grinding, dough needed kneading, ovens needed tending, bread needed baking. Your legal status determined your rights and your compensation, but it didn't change the basic reality that bread production was hard, hot, physical work that started before dawn and ended when the day's bread was sold. And here's something interesting. Bakery workers, regardless of their legal status, often developed a strong sense of professional identity. We have evidence of baking guilds, collegia pistorum, where bakers would gather for social purposes, religious observances, and mutual support. Slaves couldn't join these guilds, but freedmen and free bakers could, and these organizations provided a sense of community and belonging that transcended the legal distinctions between different workers. Tombstones and inscriptions from the Roman period sometimes identify the deceased by their profession. Here lies Marcus, a baker. The work defined you, became part of your identity. You might spend 30 or 40 years working with flour and ovens, and by the end of that time, Being a baker wasn't just what you did, it was who you were. So whether you were a slave counting the years until possible freedom, a freedman building a new life, or a free citizen making your way in essential trade, the bakery was your world, and the rhythm of bread production was the rhythm of your life. Now let's talk about what the work actually felt like, because this is where the reality of being a Roman bakery worker becomes visceral. Start with the heat. In summer, in a Mediterranean climate, ambient temperatures could easily reach 90 or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the starting point, before you factor in the massive oven radiating heat into an enclosed space. When that oven was at full temperature, baking dozens of loaves, the area around it might be 20 or 30 degrees hotter than the outside air. You were working in temperatures that approached 120 degrees or more. Your body would sweat constantly, profusely. Sweat would run down your face, sting your eyes, soak your tunic. Romans didn't have modern moisture-wicking fabrics. You wore linen or wool, and once it got wet, it stayed wet. The fabric would cling to your skin, chafing as you moved. You drink water constantly, trying to replace what you were losing through sweat, but you'd never quite catch up. The dehydration would give you a persistent headache, make you lightheaded, sap your energy, and yet you couldn't slow down. The work had its own rhythm, its own deadline. The dough needed to be kneaded, the loaves needed to be shaped, the oven needed to be loaded. The heat was just something you endured. In winter, the heat was actually welcome. Roman buildings weren't well insulated, and working near the oven meant you were one of the few warm places in the city. Your hands would thaw, your joints would loosen, and the work would be physically easier because you weren't fighting the cold. But that also meant you were the only warm space, and going outside into the cold after hours in the heat created its own shock to the system. Then there was the physical labor itself. Kneading dough was an arm, shoulder, and back workout that would make modern gym exercises look gentle. You'd press into the dough with your weight, fold it, turn it, press again, over and over for 30 minutes or an hour per batch. Your forearms would burn, your shoulders would ache, your lower back would develop a persistent pain from the constant bending and lifting. If you were kneading with your feet, climbing into the trough and essentially walking on the dough, you'd use different muscles, but the work was just as demanding. Your calves and thighs would burn from the constant stepping and pressing. Your balance would be challenged as you worked on the unstable surface of the dough. And you'd do this batch after batch, day after day. The repetitive motion would take its toll over years. Many older bakers developed permanent joint problems. Arthritis in the hands, worn down shoulders, back problems that would follow them the rest of their lives. This was before any understanding of ergonomics, before any concept of preventing repetitive strain injuries. You just worked until you couldn't work anymore, and then you hoped you'd saved enough or had family to support you. The flour dust was another constant. Fine particles of flour would hang in the air, especially near the mills and during the mixing process. You'd breathe it in constantly. It would coat your skin, work its way into your hair, settle in the folds of your clothing. At the end of the day, you'd be covered in a fine white powder, looking like you'd been dusted with snow. This constant exposure to flour dust wasn't good for your lungs. Many bakers developed respiratory problems over the years. A persistent cough, difficulty breathing, the ancient equivalent of what we'd now recognize as occupational lung disease. But there was no understanding of this connection, no protective equipment, no ventilation systems. You just breathed the air you worked in and hoped for the best. The burns were inevitable. When you're working near an oven hot enough to bake bread, and you're doing it for hours every day, you will get burned. Small burns from accidentally brushing against hot surfaces, more serious burns from mishaps loading or unloading the oven. The baking peels could become hot from proximity to the oven, and if you weren't careful, you'd burn your hands. A loaf could stick to the oven floor, and in trying to free it, you'd lean too close and singe your face or arms. Romans didn't have modern burn treatment. They might use oil or honey on burns, which actually isn't terrible treatment, but serious burns could become infected, and infections could be deadly. Many bakers had visible scars on their arms and hands, permanent reminders of years working with fire. Then there were the cuts and scrapes, sharp knives for scoring loaves, rough stone surfaces, wooden tools with splinters, all contributed to an environment where minor injuries were daily occurrences. Most healed without issue, but without antibiotics, any cut had the potential to become infected. You'd learn to be careful, to work with attention to what you were doing, but accidents happened. The flour itself could cause skin problems. The combination of flour, dust, sweat, and constant moisture would create conditions for rashes and skin irritation. Your hands, constantly in contact with dough, would become dry and cracked. The yeast in the fermentum could cause skin reactions in some people. There was no hand cream, no understanding of skincare. You just dealt with painful, cracked hands as part of the job. The hours took their toll in other ways. Starting work at 2 or 3 a.m. meant going to bed extremely early, probably soon after sunset. This put you out of sync with much of Roman social life, which often happened in the evenings. If you had a family, you might barely see them. If you were young and wanted a social life, too bad. The bakery owned your schedule. The lack of days off meant no time for your body to recover. Modern understanding of exercise and recovery emphasizes the importance of rest days. Roman bakers didn't get rest days. The accumulated fatigue was constant. You were always somewhat tired, always somewhat sore, never fully recovered before starting the next day's work. And there was the simple boredom. The work was repetitive. The same tasks, in the same order, day after day. Mill the grain, knead the dough, shape the loaves, bake the bread, sell the product. Next day, do it all again. The routines was numbing. Your mind would wander, and in wandering, you might make mistakes that needed fixing, or worse, that ruined a batch of dough. Some workers found a meditative quality in the repetition. The rhythm of kneading, the familiar motions of shaping loaves, the predictable progression of the work could be soothing in its own way. But that required a mindset that not everyone could achieve, especially if you were a slave working against your will, or a free worker who had taken this job because it was the only option available. The social dynamics added their own stress. If you were a slave, you had no control over your circumstances and could be punished for any perceived failure or slowness. If you were a freedman, you might be working alongside the person who used to own you, trying to maintain a professional relationship with someone who had once had absolute power over you. If you were free but working with slaves, the moral complications of that relationship might weigh on you, or you might become callous to it, which had its own psychological costs. Through all of this, the work had to be done. The bread had to be made. Romans needed their daily bread, and the system depended on people like you showing up day after day, enduring the heat, the labor, the discomfort, and the grinding repetition to make it happen. So you showed up, you endured, and at the end of the day, you went to sleep, knowing you'd wake in a few hours and do it all over again. Let's walk through a typical day. And when I say typical, I mean every day, because bakeries operated daily. Romans needed fresh bread every day, so bakers worked every day. No weekends off, no vacation days, just the relentless daily cycle of production. Your day started absurdly early. We're talking 2 or 3 a.m., while most of the city was still asleep. Why so early? Because the bread-making process took hours, and customers expected fresh bread to be available by mid-morning. Working backward from that deadline, you needed to start before dawn just to have everything ready in time. If you were a slave, you probably slept in the bakery itself or in adjacent quarters. No commute, but also no escape from the work environment. If you were a freedman or free worker, you'd make your way through dark streets to the bakery, possibly carrying a small oil lamp to light your way. Roman streets at night could be dangerous, and they weren't well lit, so this early morning walk was its own small adventure. You'd arrive at the bakery to find the fires already being started. The oven needed hours to heat properly, so getting the wood fires going was one of the first tasks of the day. If you were assigned to fire duty, you'd spend the first hour or so feeding wood into the oven, building up the heat gradually, monitoring the temperature by experience and feel. There were no thermometers, so you learned to judge oven temperature by how the interior looked, how it felt when you held your hand near the opening, and eventually by how quickly a test piece of dough began to brown. While the oven heated, the milling started. If your bakery used animal power, the donkeys or mules needed to be harnessed and set to their circular walk, turning the millstones. The sound of grinding would fill the bakery, that low rumbling that would continue for hours. Grain would be fed into the mill continuously, and flour would pour out into collection containers below. This flour needed to be sieved. Roman flour wasn't uniform. Depending on how finely the grain was ground and how thoroughly it was sieved, you could produce different grades of flour. The finest white flour, siligo, was expensive and used for premium bread bought by wealthy Romans. Coarser, whole-grain flour was cheaper and more common, used for the daily bread of ordinary people. Your bakery probably produced both types, or focused on one depending on your customer base. Around 4 or 5 a.m., the kneading would begin. This was the most physically demanding part of the process. Large batches of flour would be combined with water and other ingredients in huge troughs. The basic recipe for Roman bread was simple: flour, water, salt, and sometimes a leavening agent. Romans had discovered that saving a bit of fermented dough from the previous day and adding it to new dough would make the bread rise. We'd call this a sourdough starter. They called it fermentum. The kneading process was brutal. You'd work the dough with your hands, or climb into the trough and knead it with your feet, pressing and folding until the dough developed the right texture and elasticity. This took time and tremendous effort. Your arms would burn, your legs would ache if you were kneading by foot, and the repetitive motion would wear on your body day after day. Once the dough was properly kneaded, it needed to rest and rise. This was one of the few moments of relative calm in the bakery day. The dough would sit in the troughs, covered with cloth, slowly expanding as the fermentation did its work. This rest period might last an hour or two, and during this time, workers could catch their breath, maybe eat a quick breakfast, prepare the tools needed for the next stages. While the dough rose, the oven reached its peak temperature. The wood fires would be raked out, leaving just the hot bricks and stones that would bake the bread. This was skilled work. Leave the fires in too long, and the bread would burn on the outside before cooking through. Remove them too early, and the oven wouldn't be hot enough to bake properly. Around 6 or 7 a.m., the shaping would begin. The risen dough would be divided into individual portions, shaped into loaves. Roman bread came in different forms. The most common was a round loaf, scored in a cross pattern on top. These scoring marks served a practical purpose. They allowed steam to escape during baking and helped the bread expand evenly. But they also made the loaves easier to divide into quarters, which is how many Romans ate their bread, tearing or cutting it into 4 sections. Shaping hundreds of loaves required speed and consistency. You'd grab a portion of dough, quickly form it into a round shape, score the top, and place it on a wooden board or directly on the baking peel. Then repeat, over and over, until all the dough was shaped and ready for the oven. Loading the oven was its own skill. The baking peels were long wooden tools with a flat surface at the end, and you'd slide loaves onto them, then carefully transfer the loaves into the hot oven. This required working close to intense heat, sliding the peel into the oven, tilting it just right so the loaf slid off onto the oven floor, then quickly pulling the peel back out before it scorched. You'd work quickly, loading the entire oven with as many loaves as would fit. A large commercial bakery oven might hold 50 or 100 loaves at a time. Once loaded, the oven door might be partially closed to retain heat, and then you'd wait. Baking times varied depending on the bread type and oven temperature, but generally, loaves would bake for 30 to 40 minutes. During this time, you'd monitor the oven, checking periodically, adjusting as needed. The smell during this phase was incredible. The aroma of baking bread would fill the bakery and spill out into the street, advertising your product better than any sign. When the bread was done, you'd unload the oven using the peels, carefully sliding them under each hot loaf and pulling it out. The fresh loaves would be impossibly hot, so they'd be set on racks or tables to cool slightly. And as soon as the oven was unloaded, you'd start loading the next batch, because you had more dough waiting and more bread to produce. This cycle would continue through the morning. By around 10 a.m. or noon, you'd have dozens or hundreds of fresh loaves ready, and the shop would open to customers. If you were assigned to sales duty, you'd take your position at the counter, dealing with customers, counting coins, handing over loaves. If you were still working in the back, you'd continue production, because tomorrow you'd need to start the whole process over again. The afternoon might bring some cleanup work. Scrubbing out the kneading troughs, sweeping up flour dust, maintaining equipment, preparing for the next day. If you were lucky, you might finish by mid-afternoon. If you were a slave, your day might continue with other tasks assigned by your owner. And then, after perhaps 12 or 14 hours of work, you'd be done, until tomorrow, when you'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and do it all over again. Let's talk about what you worked with, because the materials and tools of Roman baking were specialized, essential, and in many cases, quite different from what you might expect. Start with the grain. Roman bread was made primarily from wheat, though barley was used for cheaper breads and sometimes for animal feed. The wheat came in different varieties, but the two main types were triticum, a common wheat, and far, which was an earlier variety. By the imperial period, wheat was being imported to Rome from Egypt and North Africa in massive quantities, because Italy alone couldn't produce enough to feed the urban population. The grain arrived at the bakery in sacks, and it needed to be stored carefully. Grain was valuable, and it needed to be kept dry to prevent mold and insect infestation. Bakeries would have storage areas, often rooms with raised floors to keep the sacks off damp ground, and these rooms would be checked regularly for signs of pests. Before grain could be milled, it sometimes needed to be cleaned. Grain straight from the fields might contain bits of chaff, small stones, or other debris. Some bakeries had workers who would sort through the grain, removing impurities. This was tedious work, sitting with baskets of grain, sorting through it by hand, but it was necessary because you didn't want stones ending up in the millstones where they could cause damage. The millstones themselves were remarkable pieces of technology. Roman mills were incredibly effective at grinding grain into flour, and the volcanic rock they were made from was ideal for the purpose. The surface of the stones was rough, helping to crush the grain, but not so rough that it would produce overly coarse flour. The stones needed to be maintained, and periodically the surface would be recut or refreshed to restore its grinding effectiveness. The lower stone, the meta, was fixed in place. The upper stone, the cotillus, rotated around it. The grain was poured into an opening at the top of the cotillus, and as the stone turned, the grain would work its way down between the surfaces, being crushed into progressively finer powder, eventually emerging at the bottom as flour. If your bakery used animal power, you'd become very familiar with the donkeys or mules. These animals were essential to the operation, and they needed to be cared for, fed, and maintained. Harnesses had to be fitted properly so they could pull without injury. The animals would walk in circles for hours, so they needed breaks, water, and feeding. In some ways, these working animals were among the most valuable assets the bakery owned. Water was essential and needed to be available in quantity. Some bakeries had connections to the Roman aqueduct system, if they were in cities with such infrastructure. Others relied on wells. The water needed to be clean because it was going directly into the bread. It was used for mixing dough, cleaning equipment, and general hygiene. Salt was another essential ingredient. Roman bread wasn't usually very salty by modern standards, but a little salt improved the flavor and helped control fermentation. Salt was a valuable commodity in the Roman world, sometimes used as payment for workers. The word salary literally comes from sal, the Latin word for salt, and the practice of paying salt rations. The fermentum, that piece of fermented dough saved from the previous batch, was your leavening agent. This required careful management. The fermentum needed to be kept active and healthy, which meant regular feeding with fresh flour and water. If it died or became contaminated, your bread wouldn't rise properly. Many bakeries guarded their fermentum carefully, treating it as a secret ingredient that gave their bread its distinctive flavor and texture. The kneading troughs were large, heavy, and practical. Most were made of wood, though some wealthy bakeries might have stone troughs. These needed to be solid enough to withstand the pounding of dough being kneaded, and they needed to be cleaned regularly to prevent contamination. A dirty trough could introduce bad flavors or, worse, make the bread unsafe to eat. The tools for shaping and handling bread were surprisingly simple. Your hands did most of the work. You might have a dull knife or scraper for dividing dough, a sharp knife for scoring the tops of loaves, wooden boards for resting shaped loaves before they went into the oven. The baking peels were essential. These long-handled paddles were usually made of wood, which didn't conduct heat the way metal would. The handle would be 6 or 8 feet long, allowing you to reach deep into the oven without getting too close to the heat. The flat surface at the end would be large enough to hold one or several loaves, depending on the size of the peel. Using a peel properly required practice. You needed to slide it under a loaf, or slide a loaf off onto the oven floor with a quick jerking motion, all while managing the awkward length of the tool. The oven tools included rakes and brushes for managing the fire. Long-handled rakes would pull out hot coals. Wet brushes on long poles would clean the oven floor between batches, sweeping away ash and debris so the next loaves would be clean. Fire management required a steady supply of wood. Bakeries would have wood piles, usually kept dry under cover. The type of wood mattered. Different woods burned at different temperatures and produced different amounts of smoke. Hardwoods, like oak, burned hotter and longer. Softer woods burned faster. An experienced baker knew which wood to use for the initial heating and which to use for maintaining temperature. Temperature management was entirely by feel and experience. You'd learn to recognize the appearance of a properly heated oven. The bricks would change color slightly, going from dark to a lighter, dustier appearance as they heated. The air shimmering inside the oven was another indicator. Some bakers would test by throwing a handful of flour into the oven and watching how quickly it browned. If it burned immediately, the oven was too hot. If it barely changed color, the oven needed more heat. Scales were important for measuring ingredients, especially for premium breads, where consistency mattered. Roman scales were balance style, with a pan on each side and weights to measure against. These needed to be accurate because customers expected consistent quality, and bakery owners wanted to control costs by not using more expensive ingredients than necessary. Finally, there were the containers for storing finished bread. Large wicker baskets were common. These allowed air circulation so bread wouldn't get soggy, and they were light enough to carry when full. Some bakeries had wooden shelves or racks where loaves would be displayed for sale. All of these materials and tools were what stood between raw grain and finished bread. And you, the worker, were the one who knew how to use all of them, who understood by experience and practice exactly how much water to add, how long to knead, when the oven was ready, when the bread was done. This knowledge was your skill, your trade, your value to the bakery, and it was earned through years of hot, hard work. Not all Roman bread was the same, and understanding the different types gives us insight into Roman society itself, because bread was deeply intertwined with social class and status. At the top of the bread hierarchy was panis siligo, made from the finest white flour. This was expensive bread, the kind wealthy Romans expected at their tables. The flour was finely ground and thoroughly sieved, removing all the coarse grain particles and producing a smooth white powder. The resulting bread was soft, light in colour, and had a fine crumb. Making panis siligo required more work, both in processing the flour and in the careful baking needed to produce the right texture. If you worked in a bakery that served wealthy clientele, you might spend your time working exclusively with fine flour, producing these premium loaves. The pressure for perfection would be higher because your customers were used to the best, and would notice and complain about any variation in quality. Then there was panis plebeius, common bread, the daily sustenance of ordinary Romans. This was made from coarser flour, often whole grain, and it was darker, denser, and more substantial. The flour wasn't as finely sieved, so it retained more of the grain's outer layers, which meant more fibre and a stronger flavour. This bread was cheaper to produce and cheaper to buy, which meant it was what most Romans ate most of the time. Common bread came in different qualities too. Some was reasonably good, made from decent flour and properly baked. Other common bread was barely a step above animal feed, made from the cheapest possible flour and sold to people who couldn't afford better. Panis militaris was military bread, made specifically for soldiers. This needed to be durable because soldiers on campaign needed bread that would keep for days without going stale. Military bread was often twice baked, which made it hard and dry, but also remarkably long-lasting. This is actually where we get the word biscuit from the Latin bis coctum, meaning twice cooked. If your bakery had a military contract, you'd produce these hard rations in large quantities, and the baking process was slightly different, requiring lower temperatures and longer baking times. There were also specialty breads for specific purposes. Panis nauticus was ship's bread, similar to military bread, but often even harder and drier because it needed to survive long sea voyages. Panis adipatus was enriched with fat, making it richer and more luxurious. Panis austriarius was bread specifically meant to be eaten with oysters, though we're not entirely sure what made it special. Some breads had specific shapes or decorations. The standard round loaf scored in a cross pattern was common, but there were also braided loaves, ring-shaped breads, and loaves stamped with seals or decorations. Some bakers developed reputations for distinctive bread styles, and their loaves would be recognizable just by appearance. Then there were the panis focaccius varieties, which we might think of as early versions of flatbreads or focaccia. These were often topped with herbs, cheese, or olive oil before baking, creating something closer to what we might consider pizza in its most basic form. These flatbreads were popular as quick snacks, and were often sold by street vendors who bought them from bakeries and resold them with toppings added. The fermentation process affected the bread type too. Most Roman bread was leavened, raised with fermentum, that sourdough starter culture. But some bread was unleavened, made without any leavening agent. Unleavened bread was quicker to produce since it didn't need rising time, but it was also denser and less appealing. It was often used for religious purposes or as a cheap option when speed was more important than quality. Whole grain breads, made from flour that retained all the grain's components, were more nutritious but also harder to work with. The coarse flour absorbed water differently than fine flour, so the dough handling required adjustments. The resulting bread was darker, denser, and had a stronger, more rustic flavour. Some breads incorporated other grains besides wheat. Barley bread was common among poorer Romans. Barley was cheaper than wheat and grew well in marginal conditions, but barley bread was generally considered inferior. It was denser, didn't rise as well, and had a more bitter flavour. Still, when wheat was expensive or scarce, barley bread kept people fed. Mixed grain breads combined wheat with other grains or even legumes ground into flour. These mixtures could produce interesting flavours and textures, but they were often associated with poverty because they suggested the baker or buyer couldn't afford pure wheat flour. The size of loaves varied too. Standard loaves weighed about a pound, a convenient size for a family's daily needs. But there were smaller half-pound loaves for individual portions and larger loaves for families or institutions. Your bakery would produce a variety of sizes to meet different customer needs. The scoring patterns on loaves weren't just decorative. The standard cross pattern divided the loaf into quarters, making it easy to break into portions. Some loaves had more elaborate scoring patterns, 8 sections instead of 4, or decorative designs that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. If you worked in a large commercial bakery, you'd be producing dozens of loaves of multiple types each day. You'd need to keep track of which dough was for which bread type, make sure the right flour went into the right batches, adjust your baking times for different loaf sizes and types. It was a complex operation, requiring organization and attention to detail. Smaller specialized bakeries might focus on just 1 or 2 types of bread, perfecting their technique for a specific product. A bakery in a wealthy neighborhood might make only premium white bread. A bakery near the docks might specialize in ship's biscuit. A bakery in a working-class area would focus on producing large quantities of cheap common bread. The daily decisions about what to bake and in what quantities were usually made by the bakery owner based on what they knew would sell. But as a worker, you'd learn the rhythms of production, understand which days required more bread, which types sold quickly, and which might be left over at day's end. And at the end of each day, whatever bread remained unsold faced a decision. Fresh bread was best, and day-old bread was already declining in quality. Some bakeries would sell day-old bread at a discount. Some would repurpose it, soaking it in wine or milk to soften it, creating a different dish. Some would feed it to animals. Waste was minimal because grain was valuable and bread represented hours of labor. So the types of bread you made and the care you put into making them reflected not just your skill but the social structure of Roman society itself. Every loaf told a story about who would eat it, what they could afford, and where they fit in the Roman world. Like any agricultural business, bakeries experienced seasonal rhythms, and each season brought its own specific challenges and opportunities. Summer was probably the most physically demanding season. The combination of high ambient temperatures and the heat from the ovens created working conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Heat exhaustion was a real risk. Workers would need to drink water constantly, and even then, some would become dizzy, nauseous, or faint from the combination of heat and exertion. The early morning hours were somewhat cooler, which is part of why bakeries started work so early. Getting the most physically demanding tasks done before the sun was fully up made sense. But by mid-morning, when the oven was at full temperature and the sun was beating down, the bakery became almost unbearable. Some bakeries tried to manage the heat by opening all doors and windows to create cross-ventilation. This helped slightly, but also meant flies and other insects could get in, which created its own problems. Flies landing on dough or finished bread was both a hygiene issue and an annoyance. Summer also meant the flour could become infested with insects more easily. Grain weevils and other pests thrived in warm conditions, and if your grain storage wasn't carefully managed, you'd find unwelcome protein additions to your flour. Bakeries had to be vigilant about checking grain, using it quickly, and keeping storage areas as cool and dry as possible. Water supply could be an issue in summer, especially during dry years. If your bakery relied on a well and the water table dropped, you might have to bring water from farther away, adding another layer of work to an already demanding season. On the positive side, summer meant longer daylight hours, which could be useful for tasks that required good light. And summer was usually a time of relative food abundance, which might mean better meals for workers and more diverse grain supplies to work with. Autumn brought relief from the summer heat and was probably the best season for bakery work. Temperatures were moderate, making the physical labor more bearable. The harvest came in autumn, meaning fresh grain was available, and prices might drop slightly as supplies increased. Autumn was also a time for maintenance. If repairs were needed to the oven, the mill, or the building itself, autumn's moderate weather made this work more practical. Some bakeries might even close for a day or two to do major repairs, though this meant lost revenue, so such closures were rare. The autumn harvest season also meant increased demand for bread. Harvest workers needed to be fed, and periods of intense agricultural labor meant more people buying bread rather than making it at home. A bakery could increase production during these weeks, selling more and making more profit. Winter presented different challenges. The cold was welcome near the ovens, but the rest of the bakery would be cold, and if you were doing tasks away from the heat source, you'd be working in uncomfortable conditions. Flour dust on wet, cold hands was particularly unpleasant, leading to chapped, cracked skin that was painful and slow to heal. The shorter daylight hours meant working more hours in darkness, relying on oil lamps for light. This was less efficient and more dangerous, as oil lamps provided limited light and posed a fire risk in an environment full of flour, dust, wood, and other flammable materials. Winter also meant the grain supply might become more uncertain. By late winter, the previous year's harvest was running low, and prices would rise as supplies dwindled. Bakery owners had to manage their grain purchases carefully, trying to maintain supplies without overspending on increasingly expensive grain. Cold weather could affect the fermentation process. The fermentum, that sourdough starter culture, was more sluggish in cold temperatures. Dough would take longer to rise. This meant adjustments to the schedule, starting earlier or allowing more time between mixing and shaping. Experienced bakers knew these adjustments by feel, understanding how the colder temperatures affected their timing. Spring brought the challenge of humidity. Spring rains meant moisture in the air, which affected both the grain storage and the flour. Damp flour behaved differently than dry flour, absorbing water more slowly and producing dough with different characteristics. You'd have to adjust your water ratios based on how humid it was. Spring was also a lean time for grain supplies. The old harvest was definitely running out, and the new harvest was still months away. This was the hungry season, when food prices were highest and supplies most uncertain. Bakeries might struggle to maintain production, and the bread they did produce might be more expensive or of lower quality, as they mixed in older grain or supplemented wheat with cheaper grains. Then there were the unpredictable challenges that could hit any season. Fire was the most feared. Bakeries were inherently dangerous in this regard. You had an oven burning at high temperatures, wood fuel stored nearby, flour dust in the air that was actually flammable, and often wooden structures or wooden elements in the building. If a fire started, it could spread rapidly, destroying not just the bakery but potentially the entire neighborhood. Roman cities had firefighting forces, the vigiles, but their effectiveness was limited. Once a fire got going, it was often impossible to stop. Bakery owners would be extremely careful about fire safety, but accidents still happened. A worker who got careless, a gust of wind that carried embers into flour dust, a wooden peel left too close to the oven that ignited. Any of these could start a catastrophic fire. Equipment failures were another challenge. If the millstone cracked, the bakery couldn't produce flour until it was repaired or replaced. Millstones were expensive, and repairs took time. A broken mill might mean the bakery had to buy flour from elsewhere at higher prices, cutting into profits. If the oven developed cracks or structural problems, repairs were complex. The bakery might have to operate at reduced capacity or shut down entirely for days while repairs were made. For workers, this meant lost wages. For the owner, it meant lost revenue and repair costs. Illness could devastate a small bakery's workforce. If key workers got sick, especially in an era before any understanding of germ theory or effective medical treatment, the bakery might struggle to maintain production. And in a job involving food production, a sick worker could potentially contaminate the bread, causing illness among customers, which could destroy the bakery's reputation. Political instability or war could disrupt grain supplies. If military campaigns required grain requisitions, or if political unrest disrupted trade routes, bakeries might struggle to get the supplies they needed. The infamous phrase, bread and circuses, reflected the Roman government's understanding that keeping the population fed and entertained was essential to maintaining social stability. When the bread supply was threatened, social unrest followed quickly. Through all these seasonal challenges and unpredictable problems, the bakery had to keep operating. Romans needed bread daily, and the expectation was that bakeries would be open and producing. The pressure to maintain operations, despite whatever challenges arose, fell most heavily on the workers, who were expected to adapt, endure, and continue producing bread regardless of the circumstances. So you learn to work through summer heat and winter cold, to adjust your techniques for humid spring days and dry autumn ones, to deal with equipment problems and supply issues, and to show up every day regardless of how you felt, because the bread had to be made. To understand why bakery work mattered so much, we need to talk about bread's central role in Roman society, because bread wasn't just food. It was politics, economics, social stability, and culture all wrapped into one essential commodity. Let's start with a simple fact. Bread was the primary food source for most Romans. The typical Roman diet, especially for the lower and middle classes, was heavily grain-based. Bread wasn't a side dish or an optional component of the meal. It was the meal, supplemented by whatever else you could afford. Olive oil, wine, vegetables, occasionally fish or meat if you were fortunate. Modern estimates suggest that bread and grain products might have provided 60 to 70% of the calories consumed by ordinary Romans. This means that when you made bread, you weren't just making food. You were literally making the substance that kept people alive. This central importance of bread meant that bread supply and bread prices were matters of public concern and governmental oversight. The Roman government, especially during the imperial period, took bread supply seriously. When the bread supply was secure and affordable, the population was relatively content. When bread became scarce or expensive, social unrest followed quickly. The phrase, bread and circuses, from the poet Juvenal's famous line, panem et circenses, captured the Roman government's strategy for maintaining social peace. Keep the population fed and entertained, and they'll be less likely to revolt. The bread dole, the grain distribution to Roman citizens in the city of Rome, was a massive governmental program that distributed free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of people. This grain dole didn't actually distribute finished bread. It distributed grain, which recipients would then need to have milled and baked. This created a massive demand for bakery services. Many Romans who received grain from the dole would take it to a commercial bakery to be milled and baked, paying a small fee for the service. For bakery owners, this system was an opportunity. The steady demand created a reliable customer base, but it also created obligations. Bakery owners, especially those who owned larger operations, were expected to maintain stable prices and consistent supply. The government would sometimes regulate bread prices, and bakers who were caught short-weighting loaves or adulterating flour could face serious penalties. The social status of bakers was complex. On one hand, baking was skilled labor, and successful bakery owners could become quite wealthy. We have evidence of bakers who commissioned elaborate tombs, sponsored public buildings, and held positions of respect in their communities. The guilds of bakers had political influence and social prestige. On the other hand, bakery work was also physical labor, and in Roman society, physical labor was generally associated with lower social classes. Wealthy Romans didn't work with their hands. They owned businesses and properties and lived off the profits, while others did the actual work. This created an interesting dynamic where a successful baker might be wealthy, but still not quite accepted in the highest levels of society. They'd have money but not quite the social status that money alone couldn't buy. For freedmen who became successful bakers, this divide was even more pronounced. They might be economically successful but always marked by their former slave status. For the workers in bakeries, the social perception varied based on their status. Free citizens working in bakeries were doing honest, necessary labor, and there was no shame in it. They were feeding the community, providing an essential service. They might not be wealthy, but they had dignity in their work. Slaves working in bakeries were, of course, at the bottom of the social hierarchy by definition. But even within the slave population, there was a hierarchy of sorts. A skilled slave baker had more value than an unskilled field slave. They might receive better treatment, have hopes of eventual freedom, and possess skills that would serve them well if they gained freedom. The bakery itself was often a social space. The shop area where bread was sold was a place where people gathered, gossiped, exchanged news. Romans didn't usually eat inside bakeries the way we might grab a sandwich at a deli, but the act of buying bread brought people into contact with each other. The bakery was part of the social fabric of the neighborhood. Some bakeries developed loyal customer bases. Regular customers would know the workers by name, would have preferences for particular loaves or particular bakers' styles. This personal connection meant that bakery workers weren't just anonymous laborers. They were recognized members of the community. Bakers also had religious significance. They had patron deities and participated in religious festivals. The goddess Vesta, associated with the hearth and home, was important to bakers because of the fire and ovens central to their work. There were festivals where bakers would process through the streets, and their guild would sponsor religious observances. The Vestalia, the festival of Vesta, was particularly important for bakers. Donkeys, so essential to bakeries that used animal-powered mills, would be decorated with flowers and given a day of rest. This shows an understanding, at least in ritual form, of the importance of both the workers and the working animals to the bread-making process. Bread also featured in Roman religion in other ways. Bread was offered to gods in temples, used in religious ceremonies, and given as offerings. The person who made that bread was, in a sense, creating something with religious significance. There were social meanings encoded in bread types too. Eating white bread signaled wealth and status. Eating dark, coarse bread signaled poverty or modest means. The bread on your table told people who you were in Roman society, and the baker who made that bread was facilitating these social distinctions. This meant that bakeries serving different clientele had different social positions. A bakery in a wealthy neighborhood producing fine white bread had more prestige than a bakery in a poor neighborhood producing cheap dark loaves. But both were necessary. Both filled an essential function. The economic importance of bakeries extended beyond just the bread sales. Bakeries employed people, creating jobs for free workers, freedmen, and providing work for slaves. They purchased grain from farmers and importers, wood from fuel suppliers, tools from craftsmen. A bakery was a node in a larger economic network, and its success or failure rippled out to affect others. Large bakeries were significant businesses. The bakery of Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces in Rome, whose elaborate tomb still partially survives, was clearly a major operation. Eurysaces was probably a freedman who became extremely wealthy through baking, and his tomb celebrated his profession with friezes showing the bread-making process. He wanted to be remembered as a baker, suggesting pride in his profession despite its association with physical labor. When you worked in a bakery, you were part of all of this. You weren't just making bread. You were participating in a system that fed the city, stabilized society, created economic activity, and had political and religious dimensions. The loaf you shaped was a small piece of something much larger, and every day, when customers came to buy bread, they were depending on you. They were trusting that the bread would be safe to eat, that it would nourish their families, that it would be available when they needed it. That's a significant responsibility, even if you were just a worker doing what you were told. So the work mattered. It mattered to your individual livelihood, to your social identity, to your community, and to Roman society as a whole. Baking bread was important work, even if it was hard, hot, and repetitive. And that importance might have provided some meaning, some sense that the daily grind was serving a purpose larger than just getting through another day. So what was your life like outside of work? Did you have a life beyond the bakery? The answer depended heavily on your status. If you were a slave, your life was essentially defined by the bakery. You probably slept in or near the bakery, ate meals provided by your owner, and had very little time or freedom to do anything else. Your entire existence revolved around the work. Some slaves might be allowed occasional time off, perhaps religious festival days when even slaves got a break. But this was at the owner's discretion and couldn't be counted on. Your life was fundamentally not your own. For freedmen and free workers, there was more potential for a life beyond work, but the demanding schedule made this challenging. Working from 2 or 3 a.m. until afternoon meant you needed to sleep early. If you went to bed at sunset or shortly after, you were missing the prime social hours when most Romans were awake and active. Still, afternoons offered some free time. After the day's bread was baked and sold, you might have several hours before you needed to sleep. This time could be used for personal maintenance, washing clothes, visiting the baths, running errands. Romans didn't have washing machines, or many of the labor-saving devices we take for granted, so personal upkeep took time. The baths were an important part of Roman social life, and even bakery workers could usually afford the small entrance fee to the public baths. This was where you'd go to actually get clean, as most people didn't have private bathing facilities. But the baths were also social spaces, where you'd encounter friends, hear news, and feel part of the broader community. After a day of hot, sweaty bakery work, the baths would feel particularly good. You'd move through the series of rooms, starting in the frigidarium, the cold room, then to the tepidarium, the warm room, and finally the caldarium, the hot room. The heat would soothe aching muscles, and the scraping with a strigil would remove the flour, dust and sweat that had accumulated. If you had family, you'd spend what time you could with them, though the hours were awkward. If you had a wife and children, they'd be on a different schedule, awake when you needed to sleep, asleep when you were working. Maintaining family relationships under these conditions required effort and patience. Meals were another aspect of life outside work. If you lived independently, you'd need to prepare food, though given that you made bread all day, you might be thoroughly sick of it by the time you got home. Romans ate a variety of foods beyond bread: vegetables, legumes, cheese, olives, fish, occasionally meat. Wine was common, usually watered down for daily drinking. If you were a member of a baking guild, the Collegium Pistorum, this provided social connections and support. Guilds would hold meetings, religious observances, and social events. These gatherings were opportunities to socialize with people who understood your work, to discuss professional matters, and to participate in the religious aspects of the guild. Guilds also provided mutual support. If a member fell ill or died, the guild might provide assistance to the family. If someone needed help with a problem, guild members might step in. This social safety net was important in a society without government social services. Religious observance was part of daily life. You might visit a temple, make offerings, participate in festivals. If you were a slave, your ability to do this was limited by your owner's permission. But for free workers and freedmen, engaging with religion was both a spiritual practice and a social activity. Festivals were important breaks in the routine. Roman religion involved numerous festivals throughout the year, and some of these meant days off from work. Even bakeries might close for major religious festivals, giving everyone a rare day of rest. The Saturnalia, for example, was a festival in December where normal social rules were temporarily suspended. Slaves might be given unusual freedoms, feasting and celebrating alongside or even served by their owners. For one brief period, the usual hierarchies relaxed. Of course, this was temporary and carefully bounded, and it probably served to reinforce the normal social order by providing a controlled release of tension. But for a slave, even temporary freedom was meaningful. If you were married, your spouse might work too, possibly in the same bakery if it was a family operation, or in some other trade. Two incomes were often necessary to make ends meet, especially if you were supporting children or aging parents. Children were both an economic burden and an economic asset. They needed to be fed and cared for, but they could also start helping with work from a young age. A child might help with simple tasks in the bakery, learning the trade that they might eventually follow themselves. This created a cycle where families stayed in the same trade across generations. Education for children of bakery workers would be limited. Wealthy Romans could afford tutors and schools, but for working-class families, education was often informal. Children might learn to read and write if their family valued it enough to pay for basic schooling, but many remained illiterate. The practical education came from watching and helping with the family trade. Entertainment was available even for ordinary Romans. There were the famous games at the Colosseum, chariot races at the Circus Maximus, theatre performances, and street entertainers. Attending these events was often free or very cheap, part of that bread and circuses strategy to keep the population content. But attending games meant being awake during the day, which conflicted with a baker's sleep schedule. You might go occasionally, sacrificing sleep to see a particularly famous gladiator or an important race, but regular attendance would be difficult. Taverns and bars, tabernae, were common in Roman cities, and these were social spaces where working people gathered. You might stop by a taberna after work, have some wine, talk with friends or colleagues, hear news and gossip. These establishments weren't fancy, just simple places where ordinary Romans could relax. Gambling was popular among all classes of Romans. Dice games, betting on races, various games of chance. This might be a way to pass time and potentially win a little money, though of course, you could also lose money you couldn't afford to lose. If you had any money saved, you might patronize shops, buying things beyond basic necessities, new clothing when old garments wore out, small luxury items if you could afford them. For freedmen who were building their lives after slavery, acquiring possessions was meaningful, physical proof of their free status. Politics might matter to you if you were a citizen. Freeborn citizens could vote in elections, and in local communities, your vote actually had some weight. Wealthy patrons might court your vote, offering small bribes or favors. This gave even working-class citizens some political influence, though the system was certainly skewed toward the wealthy and powerful. If you were aging or sick, life became more precarious. Roman society didn't have pensions or social security. If you couldn't work, you depended on savings, family support, or charity. Former slaves might maintain relationships with their former owners, who had legal obligations to provide some support. Guild membership might provide assistance. But many older Romans faced poverty and hardship when they could no longer work. Death was a constant presence in Roman life. Life expectancy was much lower than modern standards. Infant mortality was high, and many adults died in their 30s or 40s. Surviving into old age was fortunate. For slaves, the promise of freedom after death was sometimes the only certainty, as some owners freed their slaves in their wills. Funerals and burial were important, and even working-class Romans would try to ensure a proper burial. Burial clubs, funded by small regular contributions, would pay for funerals of members. The fear of dying without proper burial rites was real, as Romans believed this could affect the afterlife. So life beyond the bakery existed, but it was shaped and constrained by the work. The hours you worked determined when you slept and when you were awake. Your status as slave, freedman, or free citizen determined what opportunities and freedoms you had. Your income determined what you could afford to do with your limited free time. And always, in the back of your mind, was the knowledge that tomorrow you'd wake in the dark, return to the bakery, and do it all again. The cycle continued, day after day, season after season, year after year. This was your life, and you made of it what you could. After all this talk about heat and flour and aching muscles, you might wonder, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about the daily lives of anonymous Roman bakery workers 2,000 years later? The answer is that these workers were essential to Roman civilization in ways that often go unrecognized. When we think about ancient Rome, we think about emperors and generals, gladiators and senators, grand buildings and mighty legions. But underneath all of that spectacle and power was the simple daily reality that millions of people needed to eat, and bread was what fed them. The Roman Empire couldn't have existed without a reliable bread supply. Armies needed bread, cities needed bread. The entire structure of Roman society rested on the assumption that bread would be available every day, and making that happen required the labor of thousands of bakery workers. Think about what would have happened if the bakeries stopped working. Within days, the urban population would have been hungry. Within a week, there would have been riots. The Roman government understood this, which is why grain supply was a matter of state policy, and why emperors who failed to maintain the bread supply faced revolts. The workers who made that bread, whether slaves, freedmen, or free citizens, were literally holding up society. Their daily labor, as monotonous and physically demanding as it was, kept the empire functioning. When you shaped a loaf of bread, you were participating in the infrastructure that allowed Rome to exist. There's also a human dimension to this story. These workers were people, just like us. They got tired, they got sore, they had good days, and bad days. They had relationships, hopes, fears, dreams. They probably complained about their working conditions, wished for better lives, found small pleasures where they could. The fundamental human experiences don't change that much across time. Exhaustion feels the same whether you're a Roman slave in the 1st century or a modern worker in the 21st century. The satisfaction of completing a hard day's work is recognizable across millennia. The frustration of working in uncomfortable conditions is universal. When we study the daily lives of ordinary people in the past, we're not just learning facts about ancient techniques or social structures. We're connecting with the shared human experience across time. These people weren't that different from us. They just lived in different circumstances with different technologies. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii has preserved some of this world remarkably well. The bakeries buried by volcanic ash in 79 CE were frozen in time, and when archaeologists excavated them, they found ovens, millstones, and even carbonized loaves of bread. That bread, baked nearly 2,000 years ago, still exists. You can see it in museums. This physical connection to the past is profound. Someone, a real person whose name we'll never know, shaped that loaf. They probably did it quickly, one of dozens or hundreds they made that day. They had no idea their work would survive for millennia, no expectation that future people would study these loaves to understand Roman life. But that survival allows us to see across time. We can look at that bread and know exactly how it was scored, how big it was, what it would have looked like fresh from the oven. We can connect directly with that anonymous baker's labor. The social structures we've been discussing, the slavery, the freedmen system, the economic hierarchies, these aren't just abstract historical concepts. They were lived realities for millions of people. Understanding these structures helps us understand human society more broadly, how power operates, how economic systems create winners and losers, how social change happens slowly or not at all. The Roman system was deeply unfair by our standards. Slavery was brutal and dehumanizing. Even free workers often lived in difficult conditions with limited opportunities. But recognizing this unfairness doesn't mean dismissing these lives as unimportant. If anything, it makes their stories more important to tell. The gradual changes in Roman society, the expansion of citizenship, the manumission of slaves, the rise of successful freedmen, these processes happened through countless individual lives and choices. Each freedman who bought their freedom was a small step toward a slightly different society. Each bakery owner who achieved success, despite starting as a slave, was evidence that the system, however unfair, had some flexibility. The economic importance of bakeries extended beyond Rome itself. The grain trade that supplied Roman bakeries connected regions across the Mediterranean. Egyptian farmers, North African merchants, Sicilian grain producers, all were part of a network that ultimately delivered flour to bakeries, where it became bread. These workers were part of a globalized economy, ancient style. The technological knowledge they possessed was hard-won and valuable. The understanding of fermentation, the techniques for managing oven temperatures, the skills for working with different flour types, all of this was accumulated practical knowledge that took generations to develop. It would be passed from master to apprentice, preserved in the practices of the trade, and slowly improved through experimentation and experience. When the Western Roman Empire eventually fell, much of this knowledge survived because the need for bread didn't end. Medieval bakeries used similar techniques. Many of the basic principles of bread making that Roman bakers knew are still relevant today. That continuity across time is remarkable. For the individuals who worked in these bakeries, the bigger picture might not have been visible. You showed up, did your work, got through the day. The grand sweep of history wasn't necessarily apparent when you were just trying to knead another batch of dough before your arms gave out. But collectively, Across thousands of bakeries and millions of loaves, this labour sustained civilization. It allowed Rome to grow into the dominant power of the ancient Mediterranean world. It fed the people who built the aqueducts, wrote the literature, created the art, and made the laws that would influence Western civilization for centuries after Rome fell. Every society needs someone to make the bread. In Rome, that someone might be a slave with no choice, a freedman building a new life, or a free citizen earning a living. Whoever they were, their work mattered, not just to themselves and their immediate community, but to the functioning of their entire society. We remember the emperors and the generals, but we should also remember the anonymous workers who fed them. History isn't just made by the famous and powerful. It's also made by countless ordinary people doing necessary work, day after day, generation after generation. So that's the bigger picture. The Roman bakery worker, showing up in the dark before dawn, enduring heat and exhaustion, producing the bread that fed an empire. That's not just a footnote to Roman history. That's one of the foundations it was built on. So that was life as a Roman bakery worker. A life defined by early mornings and physical exhaustion, by heat and flour dust, by the endless cycle of milling, kneading, baking, and selling. A life that most of us would find almost impossible to imagine living, and yet a life that millions of people lived across the centuries of Roman history. It was a life of hard, honest labour that fed communities and sustained civilization. Whether you were a slave forced into the work, a freedman building a free life, or a citizen earning a living, you were part of something essential. Every loaf you made mattered to someone. The bread you baked kept people alive. The next time you pick up a loaf of bread, maybe spare a thought for all the labour that's gone into bread making across human history. We now have industrial bakeries with machines that can produce thousands of loaves an hour, but for most of human history, including throughout the Roman period, every loaf required human hands and human effort. Those Roman bakers, working in conditions we'd find intolerable, using techniques we'd consider primitive, produced bread that was the foundation of daily life. They deserve to be remembered, even if we don't know their names, even if their individual stories are lost to history. If you enjoyed this journey into Roman daily life, please leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of Roman or ancient life you'd be interested in exploring. There are so many stories from the past that don't involve emperors or battles, but are just as fascinating and perhaps more relatable. Thank you for spending this time with me, learning about the hot, hard, essential work of Roman bakery workers. Sleep well, and maybe appreciate your modern bread just a little bit more, knowing the history of labour that led to your easy access to it. Good night.